Hello, my name is Gary Scudder, a professor here in the Corps, ably assisted today by the excellent Laura Genchos, whose father is a fan of Dr. Zhivago, like all right-thinking individuals are. Today I want to talk a little bit about how I use artifacts in class. And anyone who knows me knows this is a long-standing fascination of mine and a very big part of my teaching. I know years ago McGraw-Hill asked me to edit a primary document reader, which I think sort of fits in very well with how I like to teach anyway. I'm a person who very much likes to say, okay, here are 5 pages of the Quran, read it, now you tell me what Islam is, or here is a picture of a temple, or here's a painting, and you analyze romanticism for me, or you romanticize Hinduism for me. So I've always made tremendous use of it. Back in the old days, I actually staffed history classes, and I was very flexible in regards to what books people used, but my only rules were you had to have a World Civ text, and you had to use primary documents in one form or another. So it could either be a primary document reader, or you actually had the students read the Bhagavad Gita or something. So a very big use of actually getting into the original primary documents. With that in mind, I want to talk a little bit today about an assignment that I started doing last semester, and which I'm continuing this semester. And that is the use of actual primary documents in class, actual artifacts that students have to analyze and write a paper on within the confines of the class. I started this last semester in a class that I taught on Central Asia, which is very much Silk Road themed. And there were 10 times during the semester where I would have the students come in and I would just project something on the board. And I would tell them nothing about it. And I would say, here it is. You now have 75 minutes to solve this mystery. What is this, and how does it relate to the theme of the class? Now, it was not as cold-hearted as that, because I had given them some tools to for preparation. For instance, they could bring in technology. So they could bring in a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone. And we had spent a couple weeks in class giving them some foundation. And since this was a class on Central Asia, we'd spent time on the different cultures that came together in Central Asia. For instance, we spent time on China and India and the Persians and the Arabic world and the Greeks and the Romans. So they had some tools to use. So it wasn't quite that. But the notion was that within 75 minutes, you had to solve this mystery. You could also work in groups and post on Canvas essentially what the British would have called a white paper in the old days, or what we guess in corporate speak would call an executive summary, which is actually one of the things I sell with the students, the notion that this is a transferable skill, that your boss will someday come to you and you have to become an expert on some subject in an hour and write up some 1 or 2 page bulleted answer. So it is very much a transferable skill. So what I want to show you is a little bit how I ran that class, the lessons I learned from it, and what I'm doing right now. So, if you don't mind turning the camera toward the screen, I apologize. We are in a separate part of Aiken today because I had to find someplace that was quiet. So we're sort of focusing. So I'm just using my laptop. We know that my expertise as a filmmaker. Though, in fact, Laura, as she was bragging earlier, actually is an expert on filmmaking because she took a class on it. Now, this is one of the first ones I showed them, and this is all I showed them. And I told them nothing else. And they had to solve this, not only what is the artifact, but more importantly, how did it relate to the themes of the class? And they had to write the entire thing in a bulleted. It's 75 minutes total. And they did a remarkably good job, and it's also led to one of my more famous moments as a teacher, because in the midst of going around talking to other groups, I came around and saw one of my students, Zachary, actually was on the phone, which normally would lead to, pummeling from me, and his other group members were just smiling. It's because he was calling Pakistan. He had figured out this was actually held in a museum in Pakistan, was literally calling Pakistan to get somebody on the phone to ask them questions, which I said, actually, that's okay. You've now learned a remarkably valuable lesson, and this is what scholars do. You go to the experts. So they actually like this. So they discovered that this is kind of a mystery they were solving. Or here's another one. This is a really nice one because all I showed them nothing. Now I told them at a certain point, you all have 3 questions as a class you could ask. And I would give them sort of vague, misleading answers. I would never tell them exactly what it was, but I would give them hints if they wanted. And I don't think they ever literally used all three questions. And they really liked the idea of the challenge of it. And I told them, I said, look, I'm going to turn you all into historians. Because all we do is drive around in a green van with a dog solving mysteries. So this is literally what we do with our career. So this is essentially a vessel that at one time maybe held the bones of some of the Buddha. And what's great about it is the students were forced to look really closely and focused on iconography. And the fact that the central figure is the Buddha. And if you go to the side figures, you get Krishna or you get Brahma. And sort of the unspoken rule here is, in the battle for the spiritual control of India, obviously the Buddhists are in control now. And they also did some research and they found out that, the bones were long gone, but there were coins, Parthian coins, which became like this big issue about the representation of that. So they had to then write this up in 75 minutes and deliver it. Or here's another one, a classic mural from Dunhuang in China. And again, they had to sort of understand the iconography. The sort of classic Chinese figure on the right, and then you have, and this is classic Chinese art, the sort of more ugly, ghoulish Western, sort of European type figure. And if you just look at the hand signals, so they sort of understand Buddhist iconography, that the European figure had his hand up in a teaching example, and then the Chinese figure was accepting knowledge. It was about Buddhism being brought in to China from an outside source. So they liked this one a lot. Sometimes I gave them several pictures. For instance, here's one. An example. One day I said, okay, this is a story about this guy who may have married this woman, who may actually be this woman, who may be buried here. And that's what I gave them. And since there were several shots, I also put the entire PowerPoint on Canvas so they could look at individually on their screens. Now, I also said, but I didn't give them this picture until about 45 minutes in, though several of them found it. This is the story of the famous fragrant concubine of Western China, who the Chinese and the Uyghurs still argue about today. And this is a very Chinese Walt Disney-esque version of her story, which they're filming. And it deals with essentially who controls culture. How do you dominate it? And for the Chinese, they were very clearly turning the Uyghurs into little funny cartoon characters so they're less of a threat. And now, instead of being a concubine who's abducted from Kashgar, instead you have turned her into someone who really wants to marry the Emperor of China, as everybody does. So this is going to be a very big deal. So they had to sort of solve this mystery. I also used it as a way of setting up certain themes in class. Like, for instance, we were reading a short retelling of Journey to the West. And to understand that, you have to understand the notion of Swan Sang, the monk. Now, I could have given them an entire lecture on the journey of Swan Sang, but instead I just showed them this picture. In the process of writing up their artifact exploration, their little white paper, they now did all the research on Swan Sang for me and presented it. So they did all the backfilling and saved me the trouble of doing it. So in solving the mystery, they saved me a lot of trouble. Same thing here, I showed them this picture. Which on the one hand, that must clearly be Monkey from Journey to the West, except that it's not. It's Hanuman, the crazy monkey figure from the Ramayana, which led them to the notion of how did Hanuman, the hero in one epic, suddenly turn into a slightly different version in another epic, and what does it tell you about cultural transformation and the role of the Silk Road? Which also saved me a lot of backfilling. So we did this literally 10 times through the semester. And so I can show you many more, but these are the ones I'll show you. Now I'm going to pan back and I'll say a final few words and how I use it. Now, as I said, I think it worked remarkably well, and the students liked it and got remarkably high student evaluations, and they were very, very engaged in the process. And they really liked the fact that they were solving a mystery. Now, what would I do differently? a couple different things very briefly. One, I gave them 75 minutes to solve this, and they had to literally post the answer by the end of class onto Canvas. In the future, I would have given them 60 minutes to post, which would have allowed 15 minutes at the end for overall bigger group takeaway. What did we learn from this process? And I think that would have worked better, so I would have done a better job with that. What I'm doing with this semester is I've incorporated the concept. Of course, these were juniors, and juniors are a different species. This semester I'm experimenting on my freshmen because I'm doing the repeater section of 110. And what I'm doing is taking this approach in regards to a way to teach Freeland. So I'm taking chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in Freeland. And on those days, the students have to have come in having read Freeland. And then I'm going to allow them, same thing, they can get into groups, but they cannot use technology at the beginning of class. They just have to have their copy of Freeland. And I'm going to show them one portrait, but not one of the portraits that Freeland talks about in the chapter. And they have to then, as a group, analyze that portrait based on the conceptual framework that Freeland provides. And then about 45 minutes in, I'm going to say, okay, now you can open your technology, because I don't want them to just download stuff. Because I've already told them the name of the portrait, so this isn't exactly the same as what I did with my other class. And it has to be open anyway for them to upload it into Canvas, so they can look at it at the end. But mainly I want them to grapple with what Freeland said with a separate portrait. And it's, again, same thing, write a short, bulleted, white paper explaining what they've learned. So this has been very successful for me. I like the idea of using artifacts. I think it's a much more active way to teach the class. While they're busily going away, I just go around and kibitz and ask them questions. And I think it works very well. If anybody would like to talk to me about this, I would be more than happy to. So thank you very much.